Hello, and welcome to the next in a series of podcasts from the Southeast Comprehensive Center. The SECC works closely with the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina to provide access to information, models, and materials that facilitate implementation of and compliance with NCLB. We build the capacities of states to implement the programs and goals of the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. The following podcast was recorded live at the November 5th through 7th, 2008 Southeast Comprehensive Center English as a Second Language Institute. Jazzin It Up, a medley of notes for creating a culture that supports English language learners. Dr. Edynn Sato is a Director of Research and ELL Assessment in the Assessment and Standards Development Services Program, as well as the Director of Special Populations for the Assessment and Accountability Comprehensive Center at West Ed. Dr. Sato's area of focus include large-scale, high-stakes test development for general education and special needs students, alignment and linkage studies, and research and consultation to states and other organizations related to the assessment and accountability of ELLs and students with disabilities. Dr. Sato received a bachelor's degree in multidisciplinary studies in elementary education from Santa Clara University and both a master's degree and a doctorate in educational psychology from the University of California at Los Angeles.
So today we're going to start with just an introduction overview of the English language proficiency framework for standards and assessments. I know that for some of you, you've probably heard this for, I don't know, what are we going on, like the 50th time, because this has been work in progress over the past year and a half. So for those of you who have been introduced to the framework before, please bear with me. This will be just kind of a refresher talk. For those of you who are new to the English language proficiency framework, I'm just going to give you some basic background information regarding how it came about, why it came about, and the purpose, its intention. Yesterday we had a lot of good information in terms of the population that tools like this framework can help in terms of our understanding and their needs, and also approaching how to address their needs. So basically I'm presenting you a tool that you can use. So we had some good information about the population yesterday. We had some great information about some key issues in the field, such as academic language. Not that there's not necessarily consensus of what that looks like, how it might be operationalized, as Robin had mentioned yesterday. But there are a lot of resources out there. There's a lot of good research out there. So those are some of the issues that this framework is intended to help you think through systematically and kind of take inventory of what you know and what you don't know, and build sort of a validity basis for the decisions that you're making and the actions that you're taking to serve your English learners. So you were introduced yesterday to the population and some of the key issues. What I'm going to introduce to you today, this morning, is a tool to reflect on what you know, what you don't know, what you have, what you don't have, so that you can move forward in an even more informed way, especially since, as it's been brought up over the past day, addressing the needs of English learners in a valid, quality way really does take a lot of cross-division conversation. And it's really bringing together expertise and perspectives from different departments in your State Department of Education, as well as consultants or experts that you may have and have relationships with. Okay? And I'll provide you some handouts in a little bit. I don't think I have a product key. Okay. Okay. So this is the framework for high-quality English language proficiency standards and assessments, and this is the revision, this year's revision. Okay. I'll talk with you about the background, purpose, process, and our next steps, where we are in its development. The framework for high-quality English language proficiency standards and assessments was funded by the Office of the U.S. Department of Education. In particular, it reflects cooperation and collaboration across the offices of the Deputy Secretary of Education, Deputy Simon's office, the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, and the Office of English Language Acquisition. And basically what they wanted to do was reflect on lessons learned from the Title I peer review. And I just want to underscore here for the first time, because this will be repeated throughout, this is not for peer review of Title III. But they wanted but there are some good things that came out of peer review. It gave states an opportunity to really, again, take stock of what they had, you know, the documentation, the materials, how do they know what they know, how do they make decisions. It was kind of a way to document the history and the trade-offs and the decisions and look at the data that were available to states as they moved forward with their Title I assessments. So they wanted to get the best of what the experience was and apply it here to English language proficiency standards and assessments and create as many ways to make connections that made sense for efficiency's sake. And it responds to states' needs, because back about 3 years ago or so, they started really noticing that states were asking much more for guidance and information on what high-quality standards and assessments look like in terms of English language proficiency, how to best serve English language learner students. And as was mentioned yesterday, throughout the morning, as you've experienced on a day-to-day basis, the population of your states are changing. They're growing. There's new types of students' needs that you're needing to address. And so this framework is intended to help with that. Okay, so it's for you. It's to help with the interpretation and implementation of Title III requirements for ELP standards and assessments. It's to help with the evaluation by states or any consultants that you have, technical assistance providers like the Southeast Comprehensive Center, for improvement and identification of technical needs. And it's not, second mention, it's not for federal peer review. Okay? It's just really, it's good practice. What we're presenting to you is a document that will help guide good practice. Okay, we had an initial draft in fall of 2007, so a little over a year ago. The initial draft was reviewed and commented on by experts across the field, and also State Department of Education staff who were identified for this initial review. It was a very fast timeline. The startup was very fast. I'm glad to say that the department has been wonderful in providing this process the time it needed to get the input and get the vetting. So it's still in progress, but the initial startup was quite quick. We submitted it to the department for review and comment, and it goes through its various channels, not only in terms of content, but also in terms of legal issues, what we can say and what we can't say. So it's gone through a lot of filters. The draft revision was prepared and released at the LEP partnership in October 2007. And since then, we've had public comment, as you notice, public comment. We've had state reviews and comments where regional centers and just consortia of state have gotten together to look over the document and provide us comments. We've also had comments from other large national organizations like CREST at UCLA and also NCEO at the University of Minnesota. So those are examples of other national organizations that had taken the time, graciously taken the time to really go through with a fine-tooth comb and provide comments on the initial framework. We also piloted this framework with a few states, and I just wanted to skip ahead a little bit. The pilot was in the winter and spring of this year. We had 6 states: Colorado, Indiana, Michigan, Tennessee, Washington, and Wisconsin. And as you notice, there's a variety of states. We intended to have a variety of states in terms of the population of students, in terms of rapid growth states and steady growth states, and also states who are part of consortia, like Tennessee's part of ELDA, and Wisconsin's part of WIDA, as well as states who have their own custom assessments and standards. We had national consultants work with the states: Francis Butler, Gary Cook, Ellen Fort, Stanley Rabinowitz, Charlene Rivera, Ed Raber, and myself. And it was basically a systematic application and evaluation of the framework first. So it was really critiquing the framework first and examining the state's ELP standards and assessment evidence for its validity and quality and so forth. We also considered the public hearing comments. I think some of you might have attended the public hearing comments a year ago, July. State questions that were submitted and state challenges that were brought to our attention. Title III requirements, Title I guidance, efficiencies between Title I and Title III, research and evidence-supported theory, and best promising practices. The stage of implementation of relevant NCLB requirements across states. We realized early on that we couldn't come out with guidance that was kind of a one-size-fits-all. Some states had and were very happy with their ELP standards and assessments. Others were reevaluating their standards and assessments because since the last draft of the standards, their population changed. They're now, 200% more English learners. So what does that mean? It was time for them to step back, as some of you are, to say, well, what does this mean in terms of our standards? What does it mean now that academic language is something that we need to be mindful of in our standards, and what does that mean in terms of assessments? Feedback from public comments, and then information from the pilot. Is that me? That was me. Okay. It coincided with my pressing a button. How'd I do that? All right. So and as I mentioned, addressing the needs of English language learners in standards and assessments for accountability requires a lot of different perspectives and expertise, and very rarely can you find an individual that has all of this expertise with the breadth and depth that's necessary. So we integrated diverse areas of expertise, including expertise in standards, assessment, measurement and psychometrics, curriculum and instruction, teacher professional development and teacher preparation, accountability, policy, state and district level administration, classroom teaching, English learner students, students with disabilities, traditionally low-performing student populations, early childhood through adult education, and English language development proficiency, applied linguistics, and academic content expertise. Even though it's standards and assessments focused on English language proficiency, as you all know and as we've heard yesterday, it impacts so many different areas of what we do. It's not just our English learners. Actually, our English-only students could benefit in some ways. It's not just the ESL teacher. It's also the content area teacher that is going to be affected in some ways. And in terms of state departments and local education agencies and the practice and policies that are in place, being mindful of the various perspectives can help you build efficiencies across your system, because it really is part of a system. Okay, so the nature of the feedback that we've collected over the past year or so, and we continue to collect, has really fallen into three key categories: appropriateness and relevance, the so what part of it. So what, does it really matter to me? The answer has been yes, so that's a good thing, which is why I'm still here and not doing something else. Clarity, which was actually something that we really needed to work on. So we're hoping that in the revision, in the initial brief that I'll be sharing with you, which looks like this, there's a little bit more clarity, and the fuller document will also contribute to further clarifying the key steps or considerations that we encourage states to make. And then feasibility and usability. There's a lot of people that need to be involved in the process of standards and development in the different phases that are just part of good practice. And so we wanted to not only provide different points of entry for states, but also different ways that staff across your division, staff across your state, could be involved and contribute as necessary to the framework and its process. Okay. So the framework has two documents, the brief, which is this, and the full framework document that I don't have yet, that's in progress. But I'm going to share with you a worksheet that's based on the full framework. Okay. There's two sections in the framework, one that focuses on standards, ELP standards, and one that focuses on assessments. And within each section, standards and assessments, there are three key phases. The first is a foundational elements phase, and actually those foundational elements that I'll talk about in a little bit affect both the standards and assessments. So you can do it once, and then it has implications for standards and assessments. Then there's the development phase and the implementation phase. And again, the structure is intended to help states have different points of entry. It could also just kind of be an opportunity for you to reflect on what you think you have. You know, so you think you address the foundational elements of purpose, population, and the definition of that English language proficiency domain and the skills and knowledge for English language proficiency. That's great. But does everybody who needs to be involved in maybe the development or implementation part, does everybody know that? Have you taken the appropriate steps to make sure you're all on the same page as you move forward with development and or implementation? So it's an opportunity to just provide some structure that as a state you can think about and have conversations about, some common vocabulary, some common outlines that you can talk through as a department, because everybody has a lot of things on their plate. So this is another way to just kind of facilitate conversation. And there's also key elements and considerations that are presented. Okay. So the following, I'm going to share with you basically what the full framework's going to look like. So the bigger piece to this, okay, because this is just a quick overview. If people who aren't here aren't familiar with the ELP framework, and you'd like to just give them a high-level introduction to it because they're going to be involved, then this brief is something that you could have. It also gives you an overview of the criteria for standards and assessments that you can post on your bulletin board or something. And then also, again, just sort of the foundational elements and how they relate to standards and assessments. So we tried to be visual where we could. We tried to make it as brief as possible, and also lay it out in ways that you could use it and hang it around your offices. Because we hope that it doesn't sit on the shelf collecting dust, because everybody who's commented on it has taken a lot of time. I mean, it's funneling through me. So actually, I've also taken a lot of time, because a lot of people have a lot of opinions, good opinions, that aren't always consistent with each other. So this is kind of the not a compromise, I wouldn't say that, but sort of culling the best of what was presented with theoretical and research support. Okay, so here's an example of what's to come in the framework, and the worksheet that I'm going to give you is going to have some elements of this. So each criterion is going to be listed in the framework. And for each criterion, we'll have considerations, key considerations, the importance or relevance, which is validity, reliability, utility, quality, and we'll have working definitions for that. Examples of relevant documents that states have, things like technical reports, alignment studies, minutes from your TAC meeting at which you reviewed your standards or your assessments, or some validity study design, item review committee agenda, and participants. Those types of documents that all states typically have, should have, are good to have, will be listed there. And then those final three columns are for you. It's really, like I said, this is a tool to help you take inventory, reflect on what you have and what you need, so that you can plan next steps. In one of the pilot states, they have state planning, right, at the beginning of the year. So let's say this is something that could inform your state plans for the years, allocation of resources, staff, time, money, and so forth. So this could be a tool that could inform that. And next steps, which would include, something that you might be able to do on your own, or something that you have to contract out. Okay? Then there's going to be an overview which you won't have available to you yet today, because I'm going to focus on the worksheet part, which I'll share with you and talk with you about in a bit. But it's an overview of how the criteria relate to key aspects of assessment and standards, whether does it relate to validity, reliability, bias sensitivity, quality, utility, one or more of them. Because oftentimes the criteria and the evidence that you gather for a criterion relates to multiple dimensions. So it's an at-a-glance to see what criteria, or how the criteria relate to each other. And let's say part of what your chief wants to do is focus on validity evidence for your standards and assessments. One quick way that you will be able to kind of hone in on the criteria that might affect the validity of your standards and assessments is to look at this and kind of say, all right, well, as a start, let's focus in on these criteria because let's say these 4 criteria relate to validity. If, for example, you're up for revising your standards and you really want to think through the quality and utility of standards, that's another opportunity for you to look at this at a glance, which we'll have filled out for you, to see which criteria down the left-hand side you might want to hone in on because they typically affect the quality and utility of your standards. Okay? So you'll have an at a glance like this in the full framework, which will be coming out this winter, hopefully in December. It's got to go through reviews, so we're hoping for December. Another at a glance, as I mentioned, we're trying to pull together examples, kind of categories of documents that states typically have. One of the key things that came through in the comments is, efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. Just, we've got a lot of stuff. Just tell us how we can build things in or make sure things are explicit so we're not creating 5 documents when we could really just create one that includes everything that we need. So this overview will have some key document types that states typically have. And here's the part of the lessons learned from Title I peer review, right? Because you have these types of documents. So do you address what you need to address when it comes to Title III stuff in some of these documents, whether it's your state administrative code or law, certain manuals or guides will be a little bit more specific than this, your technical reports, parent resources, training, and professional development materials. There's ways that you could just, getting back to the comment yesterday about, well, this is good practice for standards and assessments generally. What we'll do, and it'll be more apparent in the full framework when it's done, is, these are good practices. We're all in agreement. And because these are good practices, there's going to be efficiencies that you can establish between your Title I practices and your Title III practices. But be mindful of these certain things that might be slightly different or require an extra section or an extra paragraph or an extra sentence or an extra few committee members because you're wanting to address the particular needs of your English learner students and address the English language proficiency content, okay, standards and assessments. So that's what we're trying to highlight there in this type of overview. And in terms of implications for the full framework, or this is the worksheet, the full framework that you'll have, is it'll help with interpretation and implementation of federal requirements affecting EL students, facilitate state processes for development, implementation, evaluation, and improvement of your standards and assessments, providing multiple points of entry for states, and a common way of talking about English language proficiency standards and assessments. And then it also is intended to support system efficiencies and overall coherence and improvement of state standard and assessment systems, because your ELP standards and assessments are just a piece of what you have in your states. And it's also intended to bring to your attention relevant research theory and best and promising practices that exist in terms of serving our English learner students. So a lot of what we're putting forth here, and then also in the full framework, will be research and theory supported. As was mentioned yesterday, the body of research that focuses particularly on English language proficiency standards and assessments under No Child Left Behind, and the context of No Child Left Behind is fairly scant. But what we're finding is we can draw upon seminal articles that existed prior to NCLB and think about them as kind of a body of evidence and draw connections among the different resources there to provide some theoretical support or some research basis for what we're presenting to you. Now, is it definitive? Not yet, but it sure is a well-informed start, and that's what we're getting at, and that's why we're going through the processes we're going through in terms of the vetting through experts in the field, through State Department of Education experts, your expertise as a State Department of Education staff, and also tapping into the teachers and university folks as well. Okay, so the next step is the full framework is in process, and I'm really hoping to have it done before the winter holidays. No kidding, but it would be really nice if it were released in December. What we're doing is, in the meantime, there is sufficient evidence in the brief, or sufficient information in the brief, especially the overview of standards, because this is a good starting point to discuss where you all are in terms of standards and assessments. And then this worksheet that's in draft form and really developed for the purpose of internal discussion at your state. Okay? So what I'm going to do is, I'm expecting more of these, so everybody should be able to have one each of these, but for until the next box comes, it hasn't arrived yet, I'm sorry. I'm going to ask that you share. Okay. I'm going to just pass out maybe 3 per table. Oh, that'd be great. Thank you.
I'm going to do these.
Okay.
You want to do these?
Oh, I can do these. Oh, then I'm not going to do anything.
Or
do
you want to keep talking?
Oh,
You keep talking.
3 per table.
Okay. Thanks. All right. Or there might be more. Okay. And there's also, you'll notice on the brief that that the information, the resources or the references that are cited in this brief, as well as the full framework, will be available at the website at the bottom. Okay. I've got enough. Okay. So I'm going to walk you through each of these documents just to orient you a little bit more specifically with what you have in front of you. And these go together. So let's start with the brief, the color copy first. And again, I apologize for my second box not arriving, but it's on its way. Okay, so this brief, as I mentioned, is intended to get, it's intended for everybody in this room. It's intended for your policymakers who may not be in this room. It's intended for other staff that you have back in the office. And it also can be shared with your district, your local education agencies, and also any consultants that you have, your test contractors, your TAC members. It's really to highlight a few things. If you open it to page 2, okay, so on pages 2 and 3, it's just a very quick overview of why it is that we need a framework for English that focuses on English language proficiency standards and assessments. What is it about this population of students that we're trying to serve that requires special attention? You know, why is it that we can't just do what we're doing with Gen Ed students or Gen Ed English-only students and apply it here? There's certain things about the population of students that we need to be aware of, and that requires special attention and resources. So that's what pages 2 and 3 are intended to do. And then, instead of just jumping full on, we tried to, again, kind of provide a systematic structure based on best practices, based on what you're already doing, but we wanted to kind of codify it. Because not only are you doing it, but people are in agreement that this is the right thing to do, the right thing to start. So we outlined the 3 foundational elements of purpose, population, and domain. And it also, for those who aren't in your state, who aren't necessarily familiar with this process, but are impacting resources that you need, this again is intended to help help them understand that resources and attention in these 3 areas of population, purpose, and domain are necessary first steps. They're fundamental to good standards and assessments. On pages 4 and 5, it's an overview of the criteria for standards on the left-hand side and assessments on the right-hand side. You know, Robin Scarcella yesterday said something really interesting in terms of academic language, that we might slice and dice it and label it a little bit differently across us all. But we're not going to necessarily argue that certain things should or shouldn't be there. We might name it differently, or we might collapse things or separate them out. But for the most part, what we've heard from across the people who've commented on this, these are good. These are good. We're in agreement on this. Some form of it, is what should be attended to in terms of standards and assessment criteria. Okay? And again, it's a way to just talk about it across your state. And that's a quick overview. And then on page 6, it continues a little bit more in terms of the discussion on the foundational elements. We sorry about the funky layout, but what we really intended to do is for you to be able to pull out this second page and really put it up on your bulletin board and think about it all the time. I'm kidding. And then on page 7, it talks about the organization of the framework, the full document that will be available this winter, and then encouraging just kind of key points on how to use the framework. For those of you who are familiar with the draft last year, you remember with every criterion, I asked that, I was asserting that you ought to be mindful of your committee. So you saw it about, 100,000 times. Well, I got the point. No repetition, so I just said it once. Okay, this time. You're welcome. So, but it is critical, and the committees may need to be changed every once in a while, depending on the phase of development or step of development. But it's not, the same committee all the time necessarily, and that's really what we wanted to highlight for those who, again, are in charge of the recruiting, in charge of the resources that you need. And then there's some cautions that I'm going to walk you through of the framework, because these are really important. And I just want to sort of manage expectations in terms of what this framework can and can't do. So let's read through the cautions in using the framework, and that's the right column on page 7. The framework is intended to provide criteria for systematically approaching the development and implementation of state ELP standards and assessments. But there's several cautions that I wanted to bring to your attention. The first is the framework is reflective of an area of knowledge that is evolving. Therefore, it's expected that new research and emerging practices will further refine the information presented in the framework. Now, we all know this in this room, that it's an emerging area of the field. But some people with whom you work may not be aware of that. Actually, there's some people with whom I work that aren't aware of it. They keep on asking me, well, why don't you know the answer to it? I said, well, because nobody does right now, but we're contributing to the body of knowledge. And we're moving forward in an informed way as possible. And that's what we're intending to do with the framework. So it's an emerging and evolving area of the field. And there is quite a bit of consensus on what good practices are, what good information is, and we're trying to bring that to your attention. And we know a lot of people are continuing with great research that will continue to contribute and strengthen the body of evidence that's necessary for establishing quality and validity of our standards and assessments. The second is the criteria presented in the framework are important for states to consider, but may not be fully sufficient for ensuring the quality of state ELP standards, the technical adequacy of your assessments, and full compliance with federal legislation. So this is just, this is lawyer, kind of attorney speak, kind of, because this, as you know, is supported by the U.S. Department of Education. And while they really want to encourage and support good practice, promising practices, valid evidence, they're not saying if you follow all these things, you're guaranteed to have the best set of standards and assessments ever. You know, it's a lot more complicated than just applying these criteria, because we're talking about living children and specific unique characteristics that these children bring to the classroom, and how your teachers are interacting with them and everything. So these are good practices, important to follow, but it's not going to be 100% guarantee. It's not going to be 100% guarantee that it's going to meet all compliance requirements. The framework is not intended to prescribe specific methodologies for developing standards and assessments. Rather, it's intended to inform decisions and activities relevant to the promotion of high-quality, valid ELP standards and assessments. The reason why we put that in there is because we want to give you guys flexibility. We don't want it to be a document that is going to restrict you in any way to certain processes and certain methods, because you each have your own context, your own history, your own resources available to you. So you can do what you need to do. What these criteria look like and how these are implemented in your state can look different, as long as generally you're addressing the essence of these criteria. So really that caution is intended to provide you all with the flexibility you need given your context, your state values, your state history, your state resources. The framework focuses on ELP standards and assessments, and while it has implications for instruction, instruction is not the focus. The framework does not suggest or assume any particular instructional approach or program for English language acquisition. So I was really pleased that we started to discuss implications for instruction and resources for instruction yesterday, because that's beyond the scope of this framework and what we'll be focusing on this morning. But there are a lot of good resources out there and a lot of good research being done. So, and we also didn't want to say you always have to have a bilingual program or you always have to have an English-only program. We didn't want to prescribe any of that, because you know what's best for your state and your students. So we wanted to make sure, though, that the standards and the assessments that affect what you're teaching and how you're teaching your students are good. Okay, and then the instructional piece, that's a separate issue that we're not going to go into with the framework. Also, the framework was not developed as a monitoring tool. That's the third mention of peer review for compliance purposes. Rather, it was developed to inform the development and implementation of high-quality, valid ELP standards and assessments that address the needs of EL students, consistent with the requirements of NCLB. Okay? So those are some key cautions to keep in mind as we go through the worksheet. Okay? Any questions about the brief before we go into the worksheet and what this looks like? No? All right. So let's take a look at the worksheet that was developed. And again, the full framework document isn't yet complete, but this worksheet is based on the full framework. And it's intended to, again, provide some systematicity in walking through the criteria and thinking about the criteria. And another point I want to reiterate is that this is a tool that you can use to do two things. Take stock of where you are and think about what your next steps could be, should be, and then how to get them. Okay? So if you turn to page 2, because I don't want to repeat myself too much, you can skip over page 1. We've already talked about it. On page 2 is where we begin how to begin, which is focusing on those 3 foundational elements of purpose, population, and domain. And you'll notice that we've got purpose and use and the criterion listed. What is the intended purpose and use of the state's, the question related to the criterion. What is the intended purpose and use of the state's English language proficiency standards and assessments? I don't know, can you guys articulate it? So that's the box here. Is it articulate? How are you as a state articulating the purpose of your ELP standards and assessments? Now, it's really interesting because in the pilot states, and these were states that had really good things in place, not everybody around the table, one, could articulate fully the purpose and use of their ELP standards and assessments. There were some inconsistencies. And so the thinking is not that you have to have one way of saying it, but if you don't, did you intend that to be that way? So if you have one, if your state says we need to say it consistently and this is the way to say it, that's great. Or if you could say, if you decide, boy, we've got like 5 different definitions of purpose and use, okay, that's fine. Did you intend it is really the question, right? So what, and then going through the table below, what information has the state used to define its purpose and use? Is it just Title III requirements? No, so what are you basing this on? And who was involved in defining the purpose? Were the right people around the table when this was defined? It's been interesting because in the pilot states, again, some of the people who were involved in the pilot, the state group for the pilot, were saying, well, I didn't get to have a say in this. I've been here for 30 years. I didn't get to have a say in this, but it sure is impacting me and my staff. And so, it just kind of highlighted that sometimes we work at a clip, right? We've got a lot to do. So this is a way to, again, systematically think through, because it's quick. You're doing this anyway, but it's a systematic way of structuring your approach and just taking stock of what you've done, where you are. To whom has the state communicated the purpose? And this, again, drawing upon your collective perspectives and expertise, getting a list, and then stepping back and then thinking, did we communicate this purpose in the right way? To the right people? Is it as comprehensive a dissemination of information as possible, as we need it to be? The third is, how has the state communicated it? It could be just your website, but given your range of people, is the website the right medium to communicate it? Or is it your website, parent brochures, teacher, professional development announcements? Do the ways that you have stated your purpose match your intended audiences? And then what does the state need to do? It could be nothing, and that's great, you can move on. Or it could be, next time we do something like this, we might want to consider something else, and it's a way to document so that in a year or 2 years, you don't have to go through the process again. It's there, you'll address it later. It's a way to prioritize, right? It's going to be similar for population. Again, what is your EL population? What data or information did you base your population on, your population definition on? Who was involved in defining the population? That's all. It was another interesting piece of this part of the process that comes up when we're working when we've worked with states. To whom has the state communicated the information? And how has the state communicated the information, and what does the state need to do? Okay, so I'm going to just walk you through a few of these, and then maybe about four more, because they're slightly different. On page 4, it's the domain. So what is your definition of the ELP domain, including information related to the breadth, depth, and range of complexity of language skills and knowledge in the 4 recognized language domains of listening, speaking, reading, and writing, as well as information about how the domains interrelate and contribute to English language proficiency in general, and the level of proficiency students need to achieve challenging state academic content. So see, this is actually a good example. You always have to have your domain definition, right? Whether it's math, science, social studies, or let's make number sense, measurement, earth science. You need to have your domain definition. But what does that mean in terms of English language proficiency? For those of you who are immersed in ELP on a day-to-day basis, well, this is, of course you have to. But for those of you who aren't, but this definition is going to affect what you do. Let's say your Title III group defines the domain. Your assessment group needs to now create an assessment about it. How are you going to make sure that your blueprint is appropriate? How are you going to make sure your reporting categories are appropriate? Well, this takes it to that next level. These are the particular things about the domain that so far we have agreement that need to be considered when we're thinking about it. It's not just ELP. It's listening, speaking, reading, writing. And it's not just listening, speaking, reading, writing. It's thinking about how they interrelate. There are 4 domains that contribute to proficiency. So what does that mean for your state? What is that going to need to look like? Not only for English language proficiency in and of itself, but for success in academic achievement, to support academic achievement. So it's a very complex issue. Okay. The page 5, everybody's favorite, committees. It's my favorite. So again, it's just thinking about, have you purposefully designed your committees for each phase of development and implementation? What are the recruitment criteria and selection processes? What is the range of expertise and perspectives that your various committees, at key points in your development and implementation process need to have? For example, there's a state that when their English language proficiency test is being talked about at their TAC meeting, they bring in a national expert for that particular TAC meeting, because as it stands, that TAC doesn't have someone with depth and breadth of EL expertise. So they bring a person in, an invited TAC member. Okay, so that's something that you might want to consider. And what documentation does the state have for the various committees it has convened? Any questions about those 3 foundational elements and sort of the stepping through and how this worksheet's structured, as well as the committee part? Pretty straightforward, huh? Okay. All right, starting on page 6 is the standard section. And on page 15 starts the assessment section, but let's focus on the standard section first. If you could look at page 7. Now, you'll notice in your brief, and you can always keep this, sorry, talk about repetition. I've now decided to repeat this part a lot. But there's 6 criteria listed under standards, and 10 criteria listed under assessments. Now, what we heard from you in the past year was that the evidence that you have and you're thinking through things kind of naturally fall into clusters, right? So you don't have to, even though there's 6 standards, do you have to think about each one separately? No, not necessarily, and we're going to have, I flashed up there some kind of overview tables that will provide you in the full framework. But we're also trying to do it here in the worksheet. So on page 7 in the development phase, your organization or structure of standards, the number of standards, and the level of specificity or granularity of standards are kind of things about standards in the development phase that you can think about at the same time. You can have a conversation that touches upon each of these aspects of your standards. So those are the criteria, the 3 criteria that we've sort of clumped together. And then we've presented you considerations A through G on pages 7 and 8 in that first column in the table. And again, it's something that, it's to structure the conversation that you have in your Department of Education. And you may want to focus in on one or focus in on many, on all of them. It depends on your point of entry here. So we have considerations such as, do the structure, number, and level of specificity of the standards support the purpose and use of the standards? Are the structure, number, and level of specificity in keeping with the theoretical and research bases? Okay. And we've got some tips. This should account for decisions about the language skills needed to succeed, as well as academic content, or academic language. C, are the relationships among the language domains and how they contribute to overall English language proficiency clear? D, are the expectations for increasing language proficiency levels in English and how they build upon skills in preceding levels and lead to skills in subsequent levels clear? Are the standards parsimonious? Do the standard statements include wording that is precise and facilitates implementation and measurement of the standards? Is the wording clear and consistent? And then G, do the standards appropriately differentiate between statements of expected student learning outcomes, the what, and suggestions for curriculum and instruction, the how? Because standards should really focus on the former and not the latter. And we found it could just be artifacts of when your standards were, when some state standards were developed. But some of the state standards that we've seen across the nation really are more instructional strategies, but not student outcomes. They're strategies that lead to the outcomes, but it's not all that clear. And again, it could be a function of when they were developed and who developed them and the state kind of context at the time and focus at initiatives at the time. But now we know what good practice is and what good standards ought to look like. So that's what we're trying to capture here in these step-by-step considerations. Okay. For now, the evidence could, or the way you think about these could kind of lean towards one or more of the categories. We wanted to, for the worksheet purposes, provide you some flexibility. So you might want to look at A in terms of validity, quality, utility, for example, or just utility. So what this is providing you flexibility. In the full framework, we're actually going to commit to it and say it's really a quality issue or a utility issue. Okay, and that's going to be our recommendation, but you've got flexibility in your worksheet because the evidence can look different given what and how you want to explore this particular consideration. Okay, so that's where the worksheet and the framework is going to differ a little bit. And again, what do you have and what do you need? And then towards the bottom of page 8, it's your next steps. Okay. And again, do you not need to do anything? Put it off until for 2 years because that's when you know in your long-term planning that something will likely be come up in terms of your standards revision or something. Or you need to get technical assistance, and then from whom? You said these are your next steps. Okay, so we have some of the standards like alignment on page 9, or some of the criteria such as alignment on page 9 are standalone. There's a lot to consider with these. We've got horizontal, vertical, and linkage for alignment. And again, the considerations A through C address aspects of alignment. And we're trying to provide you just a little bit more detail on common understanding, agreed upon enough considerations that are reflective of where we are in our field. Okay. So as you work through the worksheet, and then the standards start, I think I said on page 16 or so, you'll notice that the criteria that we have in this middle spread are sometimes clustered together and sometimes presented individually. We tried to provide a structure that was as efficient as possible. And we're also in the considerations taking you to another level of detail of what these criteria mean and what they might look like in terms of how to talk about them, how to think about them, how to document them. Okay? And again, the intention is because things have changed, things keep on changing so quickly in states, and some state departments of ed have the are lucky to have staff who have been with the department for a very long time, and other state departments have had turnover recently. So in key roles, like your Title III director or your assessment director, right? Or are still looking for assessment directors because there seems to be a shortage of those. So again, this is a nice time, I think, especially with reauthorization coming up, to take inventory of where you all are with your English language proficiency standards and assessments, where you are in relation to where the field is of research and theory, and move forward in an informed way, kind of, so that you're not having to go out and look for resources and research individually. We're trying to provide you that service, at least as a good enough start. Okay, are there any questions about the brief or the worksheet? And then I'll talk with you about what we're going to do next. No? Any surprises? Good. That's good. I was hoping for that. 30. Okay. So I think, let's see.
Could you talk a little bit about the alternate assessments? Have you been doing any work in terms of how we can deliver an alternate assessment
To English learners?
to severely cognitively impaired special needs children?
We could talk about that maybe offline.
Okay.
Yeah, yes. We've been doing work. Yeah, we've been actually doing more work in alternate assessments based on alternate achievement standards. Modified achievement standards. Yeah. That's what I meant. For the 2% with Louisiana and Kansas and some other states. So I could talk with you about that. We have been doing some work with the 1%, but we can talk about that offline. That's a whole other thing.
Yeah. But it's a pressing problem for us, I think.
Yeah.
And I think your comment is that sometimes we treat them separately. So how do we address the English language learner that may also qualify for the alternate?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the question is, how do you address English learners who also have disabilities or significant disabilities or significantly disabled students who happen to be English learners? Right. Here's my response. You're going to think it's a cop-out, but it's not. It's really a policy issue. It's a policy issue. It means you guys.
For the federal government end, because they've
Yeah.
been so vague on it, I think, because we've had a lot of discussions on this issue, and there seems to not be really clear resolution either by policy or by appropriate procedures for these students. No.
Yeah, I mean.
And there was some guidance that came out.
When we don't have clear.
And I think that's an issue that this organization might be able to come up with some, some guidance or whatever. But I know that like the English language learners SCAS, that's a topic for that group still. It's something that's been on the table for quite a few years, and there's really no good, clean cut answer or research
Yeah, that's
on the issue, to support it. It's something we really need to
that's
come up with some more research.
that's exactly right. And as I mentioned, NCEO did weigh in on the framework.
Yeah.
The comments that they included was really more have somebody with the knowledge, with the expertise on disabilities at the table to talk through. So be part of the item review committees when you're developing your assessments, because there needs to be a students with disabilities perspective in addition to the English learner perspective and the content perspectives. when you're reviewing content of your items. So they really honed in on make sure that there's an expert at the table at key points in the development and implementation process for standards and assessments, because they're going to need to have the lens and advocate for that student population, and then have those tough discussions on the tension, that exists between the needs of as a student with disabilities, as a student who's an English learner. And as Leslie pointed out, there's really no clear-cut answer, but what the state can do is structure the committees purposefully, strategically, so that you have those meaningful and important conversations. And that's really been the nature of groups like NCEO and how they've commented on the representation of students with disabilities in the framework.
You don't know of a state that has been able to do that?
To
Example of a state because I know you've been a member of this guest for how many years? Yeah. I don't see where we're any further along. I was just wondering, has anybody articulated what you
Virginia had developed an assessment, but then it kind of
And Wheaton is working on some bigger close, and I think they have Carnegie.
Illinois was looking at the grant. I'm not sure they had
Advanced assessment grant for it.
You know, one other thing too,
Well, it's like Edynn said, when people want answers, there are no answers because it's uncharted territory, right? And I mean,
and we need some research. And one of the things that I was told by Sue a couple of years ago, she said, Leslie, we're still trying to figure out the alternate assessment for students with population in general and the guidance for that. Let us try to figure out what's happening there, and then we have to look at how it over. She said, we didn't have guidance for that for the alternate assessment too, for the students with significant academic disabilities until this year. I mean, really. So I think their sense is, and again, they realize they left all of us in a lurch because we're obviously not appropriately assessing those students.
So basically, you have answers. You said we're going to start with defining the alternate assessment, then we're going to look at
And look at
not the other.
Yeah.
Mm.
So that may be reauthorization. Maybe that time.
Yeah, but it could be that one of the next steps that you have in terms of, let's see. Maybe one of the next steps you have, if you want to revisit the population definition, is to have another conversation with the right people around the table to have that discussion.
Yeah, I guess this will be my final point. Because I've been involved with every bit of our development for the last 30 years. It's kind of like you spent years remodeling a house and you realize you should have just torn it down.
Mm.
Yeah.
And
Got it.
so what I'm saying is,
Right.
shouldn't we have sort of developed the constructs and the blueprints for all these assessments at the same time so that there was better alignment? And my concern is, as you know, you're working with us on our audit.
Uh-huh.
Should we be developing that audit assessment, then looking at this after the fact, or should they be developed?
Yeah, that's okay, I'm sorry. I'm having to think about who am I going to talk as? AACC, WestEd, representative of U.S. Department of Ed work. Yeah. So I'm going to talk as Assessment and Standards Development Services, WestEd. Okay. So I would say that ideally, you think about it in terms of a system. Who are the students in your state? What is the intention of each set of standards and assessments, and which segment of the population are you addressing with each assessment? And how are the results expected to hang together to give you a robust picture of what's going on in your states in terms of students and programs? Ideally, that would be the approach. It's got to be a system-wide design, a cohesive, coherent design. Reality is that it's not feasible, right? It hasn't been feasible, you're going to have to phase things in. So I would say that the ideal is to have a system-wide approach. The reality is to have a very purposeful strategic phase-in process where you're getting one in place, but then thinking about, but keeping in mind what the other pieces need to be and how they might need to address certain segments. So yeah, I agree. I think there needs to be kind of a step back revisiting.
A lot of states, including us, are just now starting, in 10 years now, we're starting to relook our standards.
Yeah.
So we're going to be going through.
Yeah. What we,
You know, one of the things that I've raised before, and this is something that I think each state has to struggle with, is they look at their English language proficiency standards. What are your modified achievement standards for the students with cognitive disabilities? So until you deal with that, you can't figure out what the assessment is going to be for that until you really determine what are your modified achievement standards
Well,
for that
that's
group.
exactly what we were talking
And so
about.
you got to do
Yeah, those
that.
are standard standards.
And,
Absolutely.
yeah, and until you have a firm understanding of what your English language proficiency standards are, how can you develop this alternate achievement standards upon which you're
Well,
going to
that
develop your
was
assessments?
Leslie, which comes first.
Yeah.
well,
I don't know.
yeah, I mean, what we've done in terms of advising some states is really getting a schedule of when the different standards in their states are up for review and revision. And then, because it's gonna vary across states. So the first step is, when are your standards up for review and revision? Because once you revise your standards, it's got implications for your statewide assessment, right? So standards have to should come first. So given your schedule for review and revision of your standards, I would say then you really do need to go back and define who your population currently is. And given your schedule for standards review and revision, which segment of your population, so that you can minimize overlap or have overlap where there needs to be overlap. You can design your standards that way, and then the assessments fall out from them. So I know that's very general. I think if I were to sit state by state, we could come up with a plan, but that's beyond what we need to do here. And you've got, technical service providers like George Washington University, the Center on Instruction, and the Southeast Comprehensive Center and the AACC to help out with various aspects of that discussion. So I'm sorry, it's a broad, that's my broad response right now. There are specific ways, but it would require really sitting down with you and saying, okay, let's start here. What's your standards revision review schedule? Given this, let's think about next steps about the population and scheduling out activities for the standards and assessments and so forth. On your tables, my second FedEx box came, so I was able to pass out more of the brief and the framework worksheet. And Lorraine, did you also have some things?
I did.
Do you want to?
And I also passed out some handouts that I forgot to hand out yesterday, so they're also here.
They're on the pin.
They're also on the jump.
Yes,
Okay, so what we have the opportunity to do from 10:30 to 12 is to take advantage of you all being together in State Department groups. So if you're not currently sitting with your state group, I would encourage you to rearrange right now, because what we'll be doing over the next hour and a half is take advantage of time to be together, because I know that that's not always an easy thing to do, to have concentrated time together, and to walk through the brief and the worksheet. Okay. So part of what the intention of this meeting is to bring everybody together to start talking about ELP issues in your state. And one thing that is critical and cuts across what you're doing are your standards and your assessments. So there's two things that you have an opportunity to do. One is to actually roll up your sleeves and identify a criterion or set of criteria that you'd like to hone in on right now. And again, you've got the overview available to you. So you may decide as a group that you'd like to kind of explore. Let's say you've got an alignment study coming up. and you want to explore where you are right now so you can provide more guidance to your contractor who's going to be conducting your alignment study. Or let's say you just got an alignment study report back. So how does the information from the alignment study report that you got back fit into the criteria that we suggest, based on good practice as well as current research, we suggest you consider when you're thinking about alignment in terms of your standards and your assessments? Okay? So let's say that you want to focus on alignment. Alignment appears as 1.4 and also 2.3. So 1.4 under standards or 2.3 under assessment. So you can pick which one you want to focus on and start discussing, since you've got a nice cross-representation from your State Department of Ed. And then talk through what evidence you have, what information you need. Or you might want to step back and talk about the purpose or the population or the domain of English language proficiency. Again, this framework and the worksheet provides multiple points of entry depending on what your particular initiatives are in your state and your particular focus is. So since you've got a great representation from across the divisions in your State Department of Education, this is a nice opportunity to get started on those conversations and think about what it is you have and what it is you need and how it is you can best coordinate efforts, and then also what resources you might have or might need as you move forward thinking about how to best serve your English learner population in your state. Okay? So again, and I'll be available. I'll be floating around the different tables. There may be some terminology or some implications of the criteria or the considerations that may not be clear that you might want to have additional conversation with me about. And so just let me know and I'll come and talk with you about what the intention is or what it might look like or what other states might have done. But again, this is an opportunity for you to work in groups. You can pick. You don't have to start at the beginning. You can pick, but you can start at the beginning if you'd like, and start having those important conversations about your English learner population and the standards and assessments we're designing to serve them.